Hey guys, today I'm going to show you 10 mistakes that producers often make. And these are also mistakes that I have been making in the past. And now that I figured them out, I can show them to you. This is going to be for more advanced guys. If you're a beginner, just throw a limiter on the master, crank the gain, duplicate it a couple of times. You should be good to go. Everything should sound fine. But seriously though, don't do this. Don't put any effects on the master chain if you don't know what you're doing. To the point now. The first mistake that I see producers make is producing without having a strong musical idea or getting stuck with one loop. Here's what I mean by this. Most producers start working on a track in arrangement view. They often find a loop that they like. That would be, for example, this long. Then they loop this loop. Sounds okay, but you have still no idea how to develop it into a whole track. To combat this problem, I like to start making the track in session view instead of in the arrangement. That is because I can switch easily between clips that I make. I can show you what my process at the beginning of making a track looks like. So at the beginning, I start with making a lot of clips with melodies and chord progressions like this. And I have just a few tracks, the most important tracks that I always use in a track, like a lead, a bass, drums, guitar, and that kind of stuff. Then I like to combine different ideas together by, for example, playing this clip, this piano clip, with this guitar clip, with this lead synth clip. And I see what works and what doesn't work. Then I try to arrange all these ideas in session view. Here I have my verse, my pre-drop section, my drop section, and so on. And when I have all these ideas organized like this, I can simply drag them into arrangement view. Yeah, then I just arrange the track. So that's a good way to not get stuck in one loop. Yeah, to have a lot of musical ideas to work with. Just try to focus on musical ideas first. It can be a rhythm, it can be a melody, it can be a chord progression, a really interesting synth, whatever. Just focus on the most important parts of your genre and make them good at the beginning. The second problem I see producers make is something that I struggle with a lot. And that is focusing too much on mixing and sound design in the beginning stages of making a track. Here's what I mean by this. Often when I start a track, I get excited by a cool idea that I make. Then I decide that, whoa, I would like to make this sound even better. And that's a big mistake of mine, because then I spend a couple of hours trying to polish up this idea and mix it properly to make it sound good. But then I'm left with just one idea. I have no idea how to develop it into a full track. So to combat this problem, you kind of need to be in a mindset that the ideas will suck a little bit at the beginning, but you can always polish them up, swap presets, swap synths, instruments, mix everything later. Another technique that I use is I take sounds from my previous tracks, so sounds that I have mixed already, that I know sound good and are in my style. I resample them, save them as audio clips, and I have them all in one folder. Then when I make a track, I have all of my sounds that already sound good without having to mix them. Just for the beginning, you need to have quality sounds so that the ideas don't sound too bad, because that's going to sound discouraging. And yeah, I have a starting template that is already pre-mixed. I have my drums already set up in a drum rack. I have all my tracks set up, so when I open up Ableton, I am ready to create music, and I don't have to worry about stuff like setting the right volume or EQing the kick or choosing the samples. I have all the instruments preloaded up, so I can just work. Okay, the third mistake that I see producers make is not organizing your DAW properly. I used to not have my Ableton organized. So what I used to do is like search for SERUM, then go to plugins, then open up VST, then drag SERUM, and that takes a lot of time, a bit more time than done now. What I do now is just go to synths and double click SERUM. That just speeds up the process a little bit. Actually, it's more useful with samples. I went through all of my sample packs and chose the best samples from them. I have all of these samples saved in one folder. Yeah, that's a good way of speeding up sample selection. I also have folders for synths, audio effects. My favorite audio effects have numbers from 1 to 20, and you can sort your audio effects like this. And yeah, if you could just give numbers at the beginning, you can have the most important effects at the top of the list. Same for synth presets, same for projects. Another thing you can do is you can throw in some effects that you almost always use on a track. For example, I almost always use a subtle reverb on a track. So whenever I open a new audio track, I already have it preloaded up. If you add this effect, you can save this as a default audio track by right-clicking and clicking Save as Default Audio Track. You can do the same thing for MIDI, and actually for MIDI I have set up SERUM. It's actually the instrument that I use most. So I have it preloaded up, so I don't have to search for it every time. Just organize your DAW, speeds up the process and makes the beginning stages of making a track less painful. Another mistake that I see producers make is a big one, and it is mixing on monitors in a non-treated room. I learned this the hard way. I actually bought these KRK Raw kits, and I was mixing on them, and then I checked my mix on these cheap Apple EarPods, these things. And I actually found out that I can hear my synths and everything better on EarPods than on my monitors, which was crazy because I've just spent 300 euros on a set of speakers. That's actually a normal issue if you don't have the right room treatment. I actually still don't have great room treatment. I still can't afford it. So the way I fixed this problem is I bought these headphones. I think studio headphones give you a better perception of your mix than studio monitors if you don't have the right room treatment, because there's nothing between you and the speaker of the headphone. The room you're in doesn't have any influence on the sound you're hearing. Yeah, so when I found that out, I was like, I just bought these expensive monitors and now I'm going to end up not using them. And that's not true. I still use them, but I just check the mix on monitors. I mostly mix on headphones. If you can't afford room treatment, just buy studio headphones. That's a tip from me. Okay, fifth mistake I see producers make is, actually even I struggle with this a lot. When I mix tracks, I often find myself tweaking samples too much instead of choosing the right samples to begin with. Here's what I mean by this. With all the mixing tools available to you nowadays, you have such control over the samples that you can transform it into anything. When you get better at using these tools, you can actually do a lot with a sample, but still, it's a difficult process to make a bad sample sound good. And it takes a lot of time, and you end up hating your track after listening to your one bar loop for a few hours while tweaking a kick, for example. So the way I combat this is I focus on choosing the right sample before mixing and editing it. And I think it also worked this way with presets and synths. It's often easier to choose the right preset for your track, or the right instrument for your track, the right contact library for your track, instead of just tweaking the wrong thing. Okay, another mistake that I see producers make is using effects without knowing what they do, or even worse, using third-party plugins without knowing how the native plugins work. I think that before using any plugin or any effect, you should study how it works and only then use it. And before downloading third-party plugins, I think you should start from built-in plugins into your DAW. For example, Ableton has very high quality effects built in already. So please don't use audio effects just because you think it sounds a bit better, or someone else told you that it's good to do something like this. Don't just use a multi-band compressor on the master just because a famous producer is doing this. You can try out mastering chains from other producers, but please don't do things just because other people do that. Okay, this is a mistake that I used to do a lot. I used to think that mono is everything, and I didn't mix in stereo. Here's what I mean by this. When you're listening to music, most of the time you're listening on a pair of speakers, and thanks to this, you get a wider perception of the track than if you were just listening with one speaker. I'll demonstrate to you what stereo sounds like. Here's a simple piano. It is 100% mono. And now I will apply a simple delay effect, which delays the left channel by 1 millisecond and delays the right channel by 10 milliseconds. The dry wet is all the way down, so we're using only the processed signal. And what happens is the right channel is delayed by 9 milliseconds in comparison to the left channel. That produces a wide signal. You will hear this effect especially well if you're on headphones. So here's the simple rule about stereo. You create a wider stereo image whenever you introduce difference between the left and the right channel. Here we have a time difference between the left and right channels, and this is actually called the Haas effect. And there's also other techniques for adding stereo, like panning, reverb, chorus, hyper, and dimension effect in SERUM. There's a lot of ways to achieve a wide stereo mix. But the thing is, once you find out how cool stereo sounds like, you'll be tempted to stereo enhance everything. Wow, this sounds so awesome. Why not to stereo enhance the whole track? Yeah, let's put it on the master. Yeah, that's a good idea. If you do that and you play your track on a mono speaker, it's going to sound terrible. You're going to have a lot of phasing issues. You're going to lose some frequencies in your mix, and it's going to sound like something completely different, or even worse, it's going to sound as if you put a phaser effect on the master. Don't use too much stereo enhancements in your tracks. You could think, okay, so let's just turn down the dry wet on the simple delay, and that's actually good thinking. But the thing is, this introduces a lot of phasing as well, because the signal that is not delayed at all is interfering with the signal that is delayed by 1 millisecond here on the left channel, and that introduces a bit of phasing. So the way I combat that is I made a custom rack for the Haas effect, which has the mono signal delayed by 1 millisecond. You can download this rack in the freebies section on our website. And I think it's cool because it allows you to mono the incoming signal. You can check the output signal in mono, so you're always sure what this instrument is going to sound like when you play it on an iPhone or on any mono system. Here you can blend it in with the dry signal. You can select the delay, and you can fix the panning, because sometimes when you use the Haas effect, it affects the panning of your track. Back to the point, don't use too much stereo enhancements. Have some instruments in mono in the center and some instruments on the sides. Okay, another mistake that I see producers make a lot is not dealing with clashing frequencies in the mix. You cannot have too many instruments playing the same frequencies because it's going to sound bad. Here's what I mean by this. The most common problem in the mix is when you have the kick and the bass. And the kick and the bass sound good when you solo these instruments, but when you play them together it sounds muddy and the kick is lost, the bass doesn't have the punch. So there's two ways in which I fix this problem. One way is to EQ your instruments in a way that every instrument has its own space in the mix. They don't interfere with one another. And another way is to use sidechain compression or volume ducking with utility. For example, you need to have the sub-frequencies in the bass and the kick. You can't EQ them out in the bass. You can simply throw a sidechain compressor onto the bass and make the bass duck whenever the kick hits, and that gives the kick space in the mix. And after the kick stops playing, the bass has space to resonate. Yeah, the rule is, if it sounds good alone, it still doesn't mean it's going to sound good in the mix. So also check all of your elements in context when you're mixing them. Don't just assume that it's going to sound as good as when you hear it alone. Another mistake that I used to make a lot is not dealing with transients on drum samples properly. One day I was mixing this track with acoustic drums, and I noticed that it all sounds good, but on the master, when I try to make the track loud, I suddenly get 10 dB or more of gain reduction on the limiter, and that drives the limiter crazy. So it produces distortion. So I found out after exporting the track and putting it into audio form and comparing it to a reference track that I have huge transients on drum hits. And transients are these beginnings of samples. For example, this is the transient of the kick, just the very beginning of the drum hit. When you have huge transients on drum hits, you pretty much destroy the track's potential to become loud at the mastering stage. So my tip is to deal with transients before the master. And I do it in many ways. For example, the most obvious thing you can do is put a limiter on the sample, limit it properly, that way you'll get rid of your huge transient. Another way of doing it is with saturation. If you use slight saturation, it can give you a lower peak volume, so it can reduce the transient, but it can actually make the sample sound louder, but don't go crazy with saturation. You can achieve it a tiny bit with Ableton's plugins, but some third-party plugins work better. Yeah, you can also use transient shapers. I haven't used them much yet. These are 3 ways of, I think, reducing the transient on a drum hit. If you want to increase the transient on a drum hit, you can put on a compressor. A compressor always has an attack time, so it's going to leave the beginning part of the sample at a high volume, and then it's going to duck the volume according to all the parameters inside the compressor. Yeah, so with enough tweaking, you should be able to increase the transient with a simple compressor. Okay, let's talk about mastering a bit now. What I see producers do a lot is apply heavy EQing on the master track. I don't think it's a good thing to do. Here's why. For example, imagine this situation. You finished mixing your track, you think it sounds nice, but then you compare it to another track and you find out that the other track has actually a bit more high end than your track, but it's only on hi-hats. So what you could do is you throw in an EQ8 on the master and you boost the highs, for example, like this. But this is going to affect all the instruments in your track. It's going to affect the snap of the kick. It's going to affect the lead. It's going to affect the snare, everything. So the way I do this is I always fix these big issues with either the right track volume balance or with EQing specific instruments inside the mix properly. Today, oftentimes, when you're mastering a track, you can still go back to the mix and fix issues that happened there. You don't have to fix them on the master. And that's very good because it gives you more control over your sound. But still, if you can use slight EQing on the master, but just don't go crazy with it. Just make very, very small changes on the master, and you'll be all right. And I'm talking obviously of making changes that are not related to increasing the loudness of the track. I've got a bonus tip for you. I'm going to show you what my monitoring chain on the master is. Here's what this monitoring chain is for. When mastering a track, I find that when I can see all the parameters in my master, I can make better decisions. And I can also monitor other tracks and then compare the values from the monitoring chain to my track and then try to match these values. Okay, here's what I mean by monitoring chain. I have this chain set up on the master, which includes a few effects. And the first effect is the FabFilter Pro L. It has a very nice display, and I use it almost only to see the volumes of my track. When I'm using compression, when I'm using limiting, I always like to have this display turned on so I can see the changes that I'm making. By only looking at this display on the master, it doesn't show me the timeline of my volume. So that's why I like to use the Pro L's display. By the way, if you have any other plugins that are better at showing the volume, let me know. That's just the one that I found useful. Another plugin that I like to use is the Flux Stereo tool, and it's a free plugin and it's so great. Here's what the signal in stereo tool looks like when you have mono. Here's what it looks like in stereo. And you can actually look at your track and someone else's track and compare how wide this area is on someone else's track. And then you can make adjustments to your instruments to match the width of someone else's track. Okay, another effect that I use is the isotope Ozone 7, and I use it to just hear my track in MP3 format. It's got this codec setting, and if I turn it on, I hear my whole track in the SoundCloud format. I use it to check what my mix is going to sound like when I upload it to the internet. I often find that, for example, I have too much high end because my high end gets muffled by the compression of this format. So then I make adjustments to all the instruments to optimize my track for playback on SoundCloud or other streaming services. I've got the isotope inside, and this is a very important plugin in this monitoring chain, and it gives me the LUFS value of my track. The LUFS and RMS are like average peak levels for your track, and they just give you the approximate loudness level of your track. So the higher LUFS or RMS, the louder your track is. And I always try to match my reference track with this, and I just use the limiter and compression to achieve the right loudness. Then I have the frequency spectrum, and here I can monitor the EQ balance of my track and someone else's track. And what I often find is, for example, my bass is too loud. So I make adjustments to these instruments, or I EQ them differently. This monitoring changes gives you more information about your track, and it's easier to master things when you have all the monitoring tools. Okay, if you'd like to learn more, I've written 3 articles about these mistakes. There's a lot of mixing, workflow, and mastering mistakes that I skipped in this video. So the links are all in the description. You can check out the articles. Also, if you'd like to learn more about music production, whether you're a beginner or more advanced producer, check out my Skype lessons. The link is in the description. Yeah, see you guys in the next video. Hope to see you next time.